Hey everyone.
Too exciting.
Yeah, thanks for joining us for the finale of Arcadia. No pressure or anything like that, right? But yeah, thank you. Let me a bit about myself. As Mal said, I'm Andrew from We Throw Switches. I'm sort of a creative producer and a curator, and we do events and we do lots of games adjacent things. It's super exciting for me to be able to be here and chair this panel of cool and interesting people who work in games-adjacent spaces and doing lots of different things, and games-related practitioners as well. So I think rather than me introduce, I'll probably just let you guys talk about yourselves for a minute, and then we'll get to questions. Who wants to go first? David?
David is
I think there
going
might be a
first.
couple of slides as well.
Hello. When Andrew asked me to do a little intro to myself, I realized it's nearly 20 years since I first picked up Unreal Ed. And I've spent 15 of those running events for the games industry, ranging from conferences and academic days and like closed doors things with skill set, to working for a consultancy that did like national strategic work, at which I got very disillusioned, and then went freelance and started running my own events. And one of those is Feral Vector, which I started because I was specifically bored of conferences. I've also spent the last 10 years running Left Field at EGX, which is basically a way of showing experimental work to existing games audiences in an accessible way. And the last 5 or 6 years has been Feral Vector. And those 5 years have been kind of bleak and made me angry because they've shown me really comprehensively that the industry does not give a fuck about supporting things like that. So 2 years ago, I thought, right, well, I don't have to be polite anymore. And all the ideas I've been suppressing, thinking like, oh, I can't do that, it might offend someone, I suddenly could. So I don't need the photos. I immediately ordered a cheap heart-shaped locket from eBay, stuffed a picture of Peter Molyneux in it, got a bag of concrete from the garden centre, and cast like a foot-square cube of concrete and ran Curiosity Live at Feral Vector. It took the audience...
That's amazing.
I gave them a teaspoon.
A teaspoon?
Yeah, and there were microtransactions. Like I had a tablespoon in my back pocket, and if anyone came and gave me a quid, they'd get to use that for a little while. It took them 7 minutes to get to the center of it and claim their prize. Patrick Ashe got an enormous piece of slate out of a hedge and was there like... And the other thing we did with my friend Adam Dixon, and this year with the author Nate Crowley, 2 years running, we've run a business-themed post-apocalyptic LARP in the woods. The premise is that the global investors left thousands of years ago, but we can bring them back. We can summon an angel investor. If we say the words and perform the rituals, an angel investor will appear and drive back the green blight. And we thought we'd sort of be dragging a reluctant, shy British audience into this game. And people absolutely launched themselves into it, because it turns out they're as fed up as I am, as I watched a lot of UK universities kind of turn into business cargo cults. And they're as fed up as Adam was in his past work with charities, watching them also become weird business cargo cults. And people had a lot of fun and mocked capitalism in the woods twice now. The final ritual always fails, like that's the one fixed point in the narrative. And this year, Nate Crowley played Big Mike Lunchtime, who united all the warring startups into a single monopoly. And then they accidentally summoned a regulator. We're not sure what's going to happen next year, but that's basically what I do.
Top that.
I can't, so I'm just going to explain what I do. Hi everyone, my name is Paul Callaghan. I've been in games for almost 20 years now. Started off working in the games industry, and then it was so great to hear Bree talk about getting bored, because about 10 years ago I got bored with games and sort of went on my own journey to figure out what I wanted to do, and discovered that there's other art in the world. And other creative practice and other ways of thinking about being in games. And I ran a games festival in Melbourne, Australia called Free Play. which is still going and has now had like directors after me, and is really exciting to see continuity and to think about those things. I curated exhibitions. I worked with state and federal government to think about games as creative and cultural practice. I came back to the UK about 4 years ago now, worked in a game studio, realized that that wasn't for me. Got a job at an arts charity that was like, let's do games. And then 3 months later, they were like, let's not do games. And then 3 months later, they were like, we've run out of money, see ya. So I taught at a university for a while as an academic. And at the start of this year, I joined the British Council, and I'll explain what that is, as their first Games and Interactive Program Manager. Basically, the British Council is the UK's I realize I'm not anyway as exciting. The British
How many bricks of concrete do you have? And spoons?
And spoons. We have a lot of spoons.
We have a lot of concrete as well.
It's a good
so
start.
Yeah.
Do you know what you can do with those spoons?
Yeah.
Please do not break the venue.
I'll
I'm
get
just
all
joking.
of the British Council staff to do something with a spoon. So the British Council is basically the UK's international organisation for cultural relations. I work in a part of that organisation that's the arts team, and I sit across film and creative economy. And basically what we do in the arts department is we create opportunities for UK artists overseas and for overseas artists in the UK to work together, to create work, to think about creative practice and to think about cultural practice. My director on the creative economy side talks a lot about what does it mean to be a cultural institution in the 21st century and not think about games. And that's really what my job is to think about what can an 8,000 person organization that has offices in 110 countries and has one games person do with video games. And it's really exciting to be asking those questions, because I'm not part of the games industry anymore. I'm not sort of responsible for business growth or thinking about that. I'm responsible for thinking about arts practice and cultural infrastructure and international collaborations and sort of dialogue, cross cultures and cross practice, and to bring games into that larger dialogue as well. Next time I do a talk, I will definitely have some concrete blocks and some spoons.
I'm Cara, Ellison, and I am, well, it turns out the British Council's sole Scottish operative overseas. I get sent to other countries a lot, actually, by the British Council, but I am a video game developer still. I started off as a QA by accident at Rockstar North, working on GTA 4, and then I realized, wow, being a QA sucks a bit. It doesn't really, unless, well, I mean, I think that if you're actually really interested in QA, you probably think it's brilliant, but I just didn't at the time, and I thought to myself, if this is what games development is, I'm probably not that into it. And it took me about 10 years, I think, to actually realize that it was because I wasn't creating anything in that role. It wasn't that I didn't like games, it was that I couldn't have any real control over what was being made. And so I finally realized that maybe I was a storyteller instead. So I'd never really dropped my interest in games, and I became a journalist for a long time. And I wrote about games and critiqued them, first for places like Rock, Paper, Shotgun, and then for places all the way up through PC Gamer and specialist publications all the way up to The Guardian and The New Statesman and a lot of places like that. And I just kind of started to realize that a lot of the time my articles and pieces would come out as text adventures. And I realized that maybe I should just be making the games instead of talking about them or writing about them. And eventually I did kind of just eventually do that. I made a big tour around the world as an itinerant journalist, staying with and writing about individual game developers in 2014. And I got around the entire world. I started off in London and went all through America, through Europe, into Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, and then ended up in Australia. And I wrote this book called In Bed with Games, which is basically about the creative process for games across the world. And it was really, really interesting because not one of the games, I think maybe one stretch of the games I covered actually was iterating on systems of violence. A lot of the games that I covered were independent titles that really didn't actually have any systems of violence in them at all. And I started to kind of realize that I was interested in games not as kind of a violent mechanic, but more as a kind of way, like Brie was saying in her talk, more as a way of like relating to other human beings and understanding them better and taking care of them. So now I work as a narrative designer. I did do some writing for Dishonored 2, but really I kind of am interested more in the conversational aspects of games, and like, so I wrote a lot of the, you know, when people are chatting on street corners, I do a lot of that stuff in Dishonored 2. Have you heard of the best defense? The best defense is the best place to buy armor. That's the kind of conversation to do for that. And then now I work for Media Molecule, and I am also working for Square Enix. And yeah, like I like to design systems that are about investigating things that are not usually investigated by games, the complexities and foibles of humans, the way that we fall in love, the way that we, like the ways in which desire happens between people, that kind of thing. So I'm more on that side now. So yeah, I think that's everything. I don't know.
That's
Okay,
it?
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
So I was doing my notes earlier, and I was going to ask you sort of, because it's quite a general sort of panel. It's quite a broad, wide-ranging subject. But what I was going to start was like, what is your current feeling about games-related culture? How are you like, how encouraged or discouraged or disheartened you are? And now I'm just going to ask, how angry are you with games at the moment? Like, I think this is going to be quite a ranty panel, and that's great. Let's lean into that. So like, how are you feeling at the moment about games in general? Is that too broad a question? Like, where are you at right now?
So I actually reconsidered games a couple months ago because I suddenly realized that when I go to Itch.io now, I think I see a lot more feminine-seeming names of developers putting things up on Itch.io. And I know that so many more of the people I see on social media are women or non-binary people putting games up on Itch.io and putting games up often. And that is something that has dramatically changed, I think. Because when I started writing about really weird, free indie games around about 2011, which, God, that's a long time ago now, there were hardly any women who were making games constantly and putting them out and putting them on the internet and making them available for free. And if there were, I was finding it very, very difficult to find them. I'm not saying there weren't any, but I was finding it really hard to get them to be available to me. And so since 2011, I realized that women and non-binary people especially they've been introduced to tools, they're using the tools, and they're putting them up constantly. They're prolific, and they're not being scared away by things. And I feel like such a huge relief about it, because it seemed not possible in 2011. It seemed like something that just wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing it. And people like our very own Veda, she does that. And I'm so excited about it. Like I didn't see it at all in 2011. And I'm so glad it's happening.
That's amazing. That's a really positive outlook.
It is, and like, especially considering what happened in 2014.
What indeed. Paul, David?
It comes and goes in waves for me. I've been feeling, I oscillate. I saw something yesterday which really annoyed me that I'm not going to, if anyone wants to know specifically what it is, find me out.
Was it something Peter Molyneux did?
No. No. I saw something, I stayed off social media, and then I sort of went back on last week, and I saw something yesterday which just set me off. And it was explicitly about how games people talk about other arts practice. Like that's actually, I've discovered that's the thing that really niggles at me. a lot. And so yeah, I was quite angry, and I was trying to diffuse it on the train coming up. So I feel quite frustrated about the relationship of games and how it talks about literature and film and books. Sorry, books are literature. Sorry, and theater and opera and things like that. That really annoys me. And one of the things I really want to sort of address in the work that I do is bringing those things closer together. The flip side is that a lot of the conversations I have with kind of larger cultural institutions, museums and galleries and things like that, they're really excited about games, and they're really excited about looking at games through their specific kind of institutional lenses. So it's like the Media Museum in Bradford is like, we want to think about games in this way, or the Science Museum is really interested in these things. And these conversations happen in a way that is sort of separate from production and separate from audiences and separate from trying to sell a thing to another person, like outside of modes of consumption. And that makes me really excited. And when I'm at work and I'm sort of dealing with the other art form teams, like theater and dance and music and film, the sort of enthusiasm that those people have for bringing games into their practice and into their discussions, that really excites me and that really energizes me. And I find myself, there's effectively a continuum, and on any day I'm never sure what's going to tip me to like feeling all right or feeling really bad about that continuum.
Marie Fulston has infiltrated the V&A Museum in London.
She has.
So we've got an insider, and she's made an entire huge exhibition about video games. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, and things like people like Marie, people like Holly Gramazio, people like David. I find myself enthused by people doing work now, and I find that really energizes me. What brings me down is when I sort of I almost said what it was in public, and this has been recorded, so I'm going to be very careful. But yeah, I sort of just see glimpses of like mainstream games culture, or like crossover stuff, or games people like trying to talk about other art forms, and I'm just like, okay, you're making an attempt, and that's great, but you're not quite there yet, and that really bugs me. And that sounds quite condescending, and I absolutely mean it too. But yeah, that stuff. So I guess that's. The question is, it depends on the day.
That's cool.
In answer to your question, and related to the V&A, that event you DJ'd at that Marie held, the late thing, granted the magazine that did this is basically the hello of the video games industry, but as one of the many things going on there was a room with Blizzard's new Hearthstone expansion in. And this magazine reported the entire event at the V&A, like a serious cultural institution that has over 100 years of curatorial experience and now is bringing those practices to bear on video games. I nearly said the name of the magazine. I probably should. I don't know. Anyway, the magazine reported on that here, as a commercial video game has launch party and fancy venue, cultural acceptance at last.
Oh my God.
I have a screenshot of that I often shove in talks. Just because.
I mean, the headline should have been Cara, Ellison, and Alice O'Hanlon
Absolutely.
DJ the V&A.
No, they mentioned that you did a DJ set, but they didn't mention Alice because she's not famous.
Mention Alice because she.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cara Ellison launches Blizzard game.
I think
Champagne smashing against the video game screen.
against the video game. Mostly I spend my time angry. A lot of my previous work was with large studios and directed at institutions. And 10 years ago, I could drag a lot of those people and policymakers towards understanding that at least indie development was a thing and that it was about to become important. But trying to convince those people that culture is important is a hiding to nothing. There are so many people I've approached in the past 5 years about funding or sponsorship. I've even had startups who've had massive funding rounds approach me cold saying, hey, we've got more money than we know what to do with. We're looking for interesting things to sponsor. And someone told us your event was interesting. Can you tell us more about it? And when I do, they kind of back away going, oh, okay. You're not saying the business words though, and you're not doing the business things, because who needs to talk about design or the future or think about the past, right?
And is that sort of a like a lack of understanding, or is that
Yes.
right? Okay, so you don't think there's a kind of sort of them and us type approach that's perhaps developing within the games industry, sort of small artistic creators versus large studios, and each looking at each other on the other side of this line.
I don't think that's productive, but at the same time, I think if you want to do something interesting and cultural and non-industrial, basically you need to fuck off and do it away from the games industry and without its support.
Yeah.
But I mean, I feel like the progress that I mentioned before, from 2011 to now, was made because it was made on, like, me lying down in front of the train tracks and going, right, like, let's go, let's do this thing, because you can see that there has been progress in that way. There has, because we just won't stop talking about it. We won't shut up about it. We just talk about it all the time. And like even through stuff like Gamergate, like what's really been happening is that people have slowly become aware that we exist, and then we're going to keep doing it, and we're going to keep making things that are weird, and we're going to put them out for free because fuck you. Like,
right?
We're just going to put them out for free. We're just going to make these weird things. We're going to put them on the internet, and they're going to have a cultural impact because the distribution lines are open. They're all open, and all the journalists need to do is report it, and all of the YouTubers need to do is realize they exist, and it's happening. And one of the weirdest things that ever happened to me was I think I actually did a talk here in Dundee some years ago, and it was like a talk about Stephen Lavell's games. He makes games under the name Increpare. He's my favorite developer, really. And he just makes these hundreds and hundreds of really weird games in Unity and then puts them up for free on his website. And every year he'll do like a kind of funding drive to be able to stay alive to do it for another year. And he's like the best because he can distill a feeling into these little games that he makes so that when you play his games, you come away thinking, I know, it's like his diary, I know what he was feeling that day. And he doesn't put any words in them sometimes. And you come away feeling like you know exactly what he was feeling when he made that game. And that's a huge talent, I think. And I think all great designers have that talent. And I gave a talk about his games. And I said, we all need to be doing this. This is the most exciting thing. Because it was a bunch of game developers I was presenting to. And I made a man angry. He said, why are you saying that we should be putting these things out for free? I need to feed my family. And I was saying, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying stop feed your family. Nowhere in my talk did I say that you shouldn't be charging money for your labor. What I'm saying is that we don't always have to think about video games as being a product. And that's a scary, scary thing to say to someone who's been thinking that way for all of their lives. And it can be just a thing you made as a piece of recreational, like a recreation. It's like you can make a game in your spare time and not charge money for it. It's not that scary or weird. And I think we're here, and it's happening.
I mean, I think that, I mean, cultural change is like a long-term process, right? Like I think it's sort of it's easy to fall back on the kind of well, games are a young medium, but you know, like they're not. And to sort of acknowledge the progress that is made. Like I sort of refer. I mean, Rebecca Solnit is an author who wrote a book called Hope in the Dark, which is about sort of social and cultural change as decades-long processes, and how you never sort of see the catalytic moments, and you never see, you know, the moments when social change actually breaks. And I think about that a lot. Like when I ran the Games Festival in Melbourne, people had done it before me, and then I took it over, and I did it for 4 years. And you know, the conditions on the ground afterwards were different, and then other people have taken it on after me, and it's like big measurable, observable change. I think is always a decade. Ultimately, when you can sort of go, okay, let's look at how it's changed. And I think as an individual, you can do about 4 years of that, like really. And so I think a lot about like how do we support people in driving for that change, and how do we observe that change? Like in the same way that Cara, you're talking about like people putting work up for free. Like my job wouldn't have existed 3 years ago, right? Like a major cultural institution having a person who has the luxury to think about games as cultural artifacts and game makers as artists and cultural producers and creative producers, and to have the freedom to like design programs to support people in that way. Like there's no pressure on me to think about business in return. It's actually like, what does a game maker as an artist look like? What does a cultural producer, how do we support those people? How do we look at other art forms and other arts practices and go, what can we learn from them? Because I say this quite a lot, like video games aren't magical. Like it's arts practice. And there's thousands of years of arts practice that we can look at, and systems and structures that support people making things.
That's maybe a really good question though, like how well do we do at learning from other practitioners?
Were you on this panel?
Sure.
We're all doing we're doing a great job. We're doing amazing.
Like, are we learning lessons that have gone before, or are we quite bad as a industry?
I think that we haven't had the space to have those conversations or those thoughts. I think, it's about that diversity of voices, and it's kind of the conversation that has been going on all day. It's more people having more thoughts and being in the world of video game creation and thinking and criticism. Just having more people like telling their own stories and having their own engagement, and I think that leads to it, and then it becomes like someone from theatre going, "Oh, have you read Liz Lerman's critical response book?" And then that becoming part of that discourse. Or have you read this other thing about, from film or literature, and bringing these other ideas in? I just think like it's sort of games hasn't necessarily been super welcoming to those types of people, but those people still want to take part. And it's about how can we build those bridges, and how can we sort of expand the people who are invited in or are brought in or feel comfortable in games.
There's a related thing that me and Marie Fulston used to rant to each other about. When I first met her in 2009, she was a screen executive for Screen West Midlands, doing support work for the film industry. And I met her through Left Field, which she came to investigate because Screen West Midlands were trying to figure out how do we get involved with and support video games. And that's how she transitioned into working on games. But when she worked in film, as a support worker for film, she could go to the Cannes Film Festival, introduce herself to people, and be taken seriously. Because everyone in the industry understood, like, oh, she's one of those people and this is what she does. In video games, every single event she went to, including GDC, she would just be asked, so are you a developer or a journalist? And the same thing has always happened to me as an event producer, less so nowadays. It is shifting really gradually. But the video games industry has been really bad at understanding that.
I just get, so do you play games then? Yes, like, what?
Do you read books as well?
Like, I'm a writer. Yes, I've read some books. I've been reading since I was very young. It's so weird. So yeah, that's a weird question I still get asked that actually makes me go crazy because honestly, the people who ask that question have no real idea of what a video game designer does. And that's kind of personally what I wanted to change about writing that series of essays I wrote that turned into a book, was that I wanted to treat games as if they were just like film or books, in terms of these people are people. People who make video games are just people, like you and I. We're not some special species that like is exotic and lives in the dark, although, okay, maybe. But like, I just kind of feel like people think that this is some sort of other thing over there. And I think actually gradually it is happening a little bit. But actually what I really like to see is that younger people especially, kind of, I think, already have accepted that games are culture. It's just we're actually fighting against like people our age and above, because I think that they've kind of grown up with stuff like Papers, Please just being on the App Store. And like now, actually, I get border guards talking to me about that. And I'm just like, I was like, so I'm a game developer, and he's like, oh, I've just been playing that Papers, Please. It's really like my job, you know. And I'm like, I hope it's not too much like that. Because that would be bad. But yeah, so I don't know. I think perhaps I actually taught a course in narrative design to some elective students at the University of Miami, Ohio, which is very confusing. It's nothing like Miami. It's not very sunny over there. It's really interesting because a lot of those students, they were half interactive students, half literature students. And they all kind of had a general idea about every single game I was presenting to them as a good example of narrative game design, like Kentucky Route Zero, for example. They had already had a lot of thought about it, and like had already addressed a lot of issues that I would bring up about it. And they were very well versed in all of these games that I thought were like really good examples of what we should be aiming for in narrative design. And I was really quite blown away and surprised by that. Even the literature students were very well aware of them. And I think that that's a really good sign. I think that people who are younger than me, which is like, obviously, you know, I'm really old now. I'm 32. In video game terms, I'm dead.
I'm like 40. I'm 40 in like a week and a half, so I'm more dead.
Right, we're both dead. Okay. We're dead.
It was about to happen.
Everyone. But yeah, so like they're already there, and I think that it's encouraging, definitely very encouraging.
But that is a super interesting point. You touched on it flippantly, but like within video games, age is like with practitioners as well. Like once you get older, once you get into your 30s and above, it becomes more interesting. You become less of the 30 under 30 type area, doesn't it? And it becomes, and there's two interesting things for me for that as well, because the other thing is a lot of practitioners are maybe the first few in their field at this point. There are very few specialist video game curators out there. Like there are very few people doing some of these things. So where's the support for these people to grow, and how do these people develop? And I know that's something that...
It's so hard because there's like so few narrative designers as well.
Yeah.
There's like, I guess maybe 5 or 6 I could name, but like I don't have very many peers to ask like, oh, so like, how do I create a pipeline for designing narrative and iterating on narrative? And like, by the way, the answer is, I don't know, and no one else knows, and can you tell me, because I'm really upset and I don't know what to do, and oh my God, Cara, my project is falling apart. So that's how we all feel about narrative design. We don't know what we're doing, because we're developing it right now, and there's no, and I'm sure that you're finding the same thing, where like, you don't really know what your role is because you're making it up as you go along.
I mean, I think, this is where this is where the value of sort of being in a cross-cultural organization is, because I get to make it up, but I also get to look at what does theater do, what do writers do, like what, the idea of like cultural infrastructure, which is a phrase I sort of bandy around a lot, like what is the path for a curator in the visual arts? What would that look like mapped to games? What is a festival? How do these things transfer over? And as I sort of creep towards my 40th, I find myself thinking about like all of those questions, and I'm just sort of lucky enough to be in a position where I can like put that stuff into practice. So like questions around like curatorial mentorships or residencies or how I can maybe mentor people. Like I've started working with a mentor, and it's deliberately not a games person, but it's someone who's been around like the culture industry for like 20, 30 years, and he'll just go, why is that important? Like explain to me what a video game is. And I'll have to like justify my thoughts. And he's like, okay, that sounds interesting and you care about it, so that's fine. But it's definitely, I mean, that to me is the you know, the challenge of thinking about games as cultural practice is acknowledging that it is just arts practice, it is just cultural practice. And obviously, like, there are production things which are different, but just going, what do other art forms do? And trying to, when we bring that stuff over, when we adopt it, is deal with a lot of the, you know, the challenging power differentials, you know, within that as well. But also acknowledge that, like, there are, one of the, and so sort of as an aside, like the thing that set me off yesterday, the thing I was really thinking a lot about when I was reading it was one of the reasons that games broadly as an industry and as a cultural sector, like, it wants to have different conversations, right? But sometimes it doesn't understand that there are rules about how you can engage with those conversations, about literature or visual arts or theater or being in a museum or whatever. And I think I'm interested in having those conversations as well, but, like, also helping people to do it in a sensitive way to, like, support games practitioners who are interested in these other things into those existing spaces and doing it the other way. And so it is a long-term process. And I'm sort of going, 10 years, my job in 10 years, how much of that can I do? And what is the change? And this is the last thing I'll say on that. Like, when I was running the festival, the best question I was ever asked about my practice was, what needs to happen for you to stop doing this work? How does a world need to have changed for you not to exist anymore? And I think about that, like, in everything I do now. It's like, what will make me stop, basically?
That was going to be
Starving
my
to
next
death.
Yes. So when I hit 40 and I have to go on the carousel, and that's what happens. No one's getting that reference. Logan's Run.
Okay.
No, okay, like
Tough crowd.
scratch that one off. Tough crowd.
Should have gone with the concrete
Logan's
cube. I mean,
Run.
that clearly was a winner.
So you mentioned that some of this work is like a really long-term project, and like audience development is something that just is left to chance by the video games industry. The creators you mentioned, and a few journalists and a few event organizers, are basically the people doing audience development for video games at the moment. And that is something that doesn't show up on a balance sheet. It's something that corporate institutions can't think about.
But it's something they directly benefit from.
Yes.
The work that we're all doing now is something that they're benefiting from, and they don't have to put any money into it. And that's the thing that I feel mad about.
Yeah.
Because the stuff that I was doing all the way through my journalism career is directly benefiting them now. I mean, it's indirectly benefiting me because I got a job doing it, because I was very smart and thought, I don't really want to be, like, starving to death as a journalist anymore. But I think that we should actually be getting paid for this labor in terms of developing the cultural awareness of people who play video games.
Yeah,
So-
well, like, scenes are important, right? Like, everyone benefits from a really healthy and vibrant scene, and a lot of the time that's a difficult and unsustainable task to take on your shoulders.
So there are some people near where I live creating a kind of small collective at the moment, and the way they're doing that is by very explicitly not being involved with the games industry. Like, one or two of them have had industry jobs and been chewed up and spat out after 4 years. One of them, her Twitter bio is death to the games industry in capital letters.
That's what we should have called the panel.
Yeah. And they're actually kind of doing interesting stuff because they're explicitly not open to those kind of industry overtures, to the kind of like, and now you've learned an accessible game making tool, perhaps you could make a commercial game and get rich. You might get rich. Or like, now think about a product.
H. Dials actually made a really interesting set of games that you could play whilst at a protest. Did you see that?
Yeah.
They're my favorite because basically they're a series of games that you play to take care of each other whilst you're at a protest. They're all analog games, and H is a poet. But yeah, like they're all these really amazing games. One of them is you choose a cop, any cop, and then you link arms with all your friends, and you choose a cop, and all you do is whisper under your breath. You take turns to whisper under your breath about what you think the cop might be saying. And I think the person who the function of it is to basically increase your awareness of where the cops are at any given point. And everyone else has to guess which cop you're imitating. So you have to kind of look around all the cops and be like, okay, so which one looks like he might be taking a shit at this point? You know, that kind of thing. So it's actually, I think what's really interesting is that people who are not explicitly games people are also kind of lending us their knowledge, which I think is like really, really amazing.
Yeah.
And like great to have people who are practitioners in other areas get involved in my neck of the woods, because it makes the knowledge sharing is like so enriching. It makes me feel like I'm not alone anymore, because narrative design is such a lonely field, because it feels like that bit in Gravity where like her line snaps and she's just spinning for ages by herself, and there's no one, and you think, God, I'm going to be spinning for ages and ages and ages, except there's 6 other people nearby, and you're like, hello, are you having trouble too? Yes. And that's what it feels like, because we're all kind of on the edge of like this abyss, and we're pretty much just staring into it going, I don't know what's down there, but I guess we have to go there. You know, that's what it feels like.
Well, with
Positive
that, well, I was going to say, with that air of finality, I think we'll probably have to leave it there. Everyone, thank you so much for being with us, and thanks to our panel. Could we have a massive round of applause for David, Paul, and Cara?